The air hung thick and sweet, heavy with the scent of luminescent flora. Ethan inhaled deeply, a familiar ritual that grounded him amidst the otherworldly beauty of Ethel. Below him, the jungle canopy glowed a soft, ethereal blue, the light pulsing like a breath. This mesmerizing luminescence wasn't just beautiful, it was the lifeblood of Ethel, sustaining the unique ecosystem and the floating islands that were home to both human settlements and the native Erelon. Tonight, though, something felt off. A tremor ran through the observation platform, barely perceptible, yet enough to make the hairs on Ethan's arms stand on end. Then he saw it, a flickering, a dimming, like a dying ember in the heart of the glowing forest. A section of the jungle canopy, vibrant moments before, now faded to an unsettling grey. And then, with a sickening groan, a small floating island, its bioluminescent roots decaying, began to crumble, cascading earth and dying plants into the abyss below. A cry, high and keening, pierced the air. Ethan scrambled to the edge of the platform, his heart hammering in his chest. He saw a figure, a splash of iridescent blue against the fading light, desperately clinging to a crumbling root system. It was an Erelon, her delicate, bioluminescent wing membranes fluttering uselessly in the downdraft. Ethan reacted instinctively, activating his emergency descent gear and plummeting toward the collapsing island, his mind racing with the memory of his own home colony, consumed by a sudden, brutal earthquake. He wouldn't let that happen again. He wouldn't let anyone else experience that kind of loss. He reached the Erelon just as the root she clung to gave way. He caught her wrist, the smooth, cool skin startling beneath his gloved hand. Her golden eyes, wide with fear, met his. For a heart-stopping moment they hung suspended, the chasm yawning beneath them. Then, with a grunt of exertion, Ethan pulled her onto the remnants of the platform, a precarious island of debris amidst the collapsing earth. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice strained. He noticed the fine webbing of her wings, normally radiant, now dull and tinged with the same unsettling grey he'd seen in the jungle. She spoke in melodic Erelon, the language sounding like the wind whispering through the trees. Ethan understood enough to catch the words home, gone, light fading. Despair radiated from her, palpable as the dying glow around them. "I'm Ethan," he offered, his hand hovering uncertainly above hers, unsure if physical contact would be welcome. "I'm a xenobotanist. I study the plants here." She flinched at his touch, but didn't pull away. "Naira," she breathed, her voice barely a whisper. Her eyes darted from the crumbling remains of her home to the spreading grey blight consuming the jungle below. "The light, it dies." Ethan watched her, the fear in her eyes mirroring the fear that was beginning to bloom in his own chest. This wasn't just an ecological disaster, it was a cultural tragedy, a threat to the very existence of the Erelon. And suddenly, his research, his dedication to understanding Ethel's ecosystem, felt profoundly personal. He had to stop this blight. Not just for the planet, but for Naira, for the fear he saw reflected in her luminous golden eyes. The tremor returned, stronger this time. The ground beneath their feet shifted. "We have to go," he said, his voice urgent. He reached for her hand, the smooth coolness of her skin sending a surprising jolt through him. He had to get her to safety. He had to save the light. The wind whipped Naira's hair across her face, the strands catching the fading luminescence of the dying flora like threads of captured moonlight. Ethan's grip on her hand, firm yet gentle, was the only solid thing in a world that was literally crumbling around them. He guided her onto the evacuation platform, a sleek, bioengineered craft grown by the Erelon from the very flora that was now succumbing to the blight. Around them, other Erelon, their faces etched with fear and grief, gathered what little they could salvage from their dying home. The air was thick with the smell of decay, a bitter counterpoint to the usual sweet scent of the jungle. Seeing her people's distress, Naira pulled her hand away from Ethan's, a wave of shame washing over her. This was her failure. As a member of the Council of Wings, she was responsible for the well-being of her people, and now their very survival was threatened. She turned away, unable to meet Ethan's gaze. "Your wings," Ethan said, his voice soft, drawing her attention back. He gestured to the delicate membranes, their usual vibrant blue now dulled, tinged with the sickly grey of the blight. "They depend on the light, don't they?" Naira nodded, a lump forming in her throat. She had been reluctant to reveal the true extent of their dependence on the bioluminescent flora, fearing it would make them appear weak. But the truth was stark: the light was not just a part of their culture, it was woven into their very being. Their wings, their ability to glide between the floating islands, their very life force, were all inextricably linked to the health of the luminescent plants. Now, as the light faded, so did they. "I need to understand this blight," Ethan continued, his gaze fixed on the spreading grey. "If we work together, we might be able to find a way to stop it." His words, though offering a glimmer of hope, also stung. His people, the humans, were the ones who had first introduced terraforming chemicals to Ethel, chemicals that Naira now suspected were the root cause of this devastating blight. How could she trust him, a representative of the very race that threatened her people's existence? Despite her internal turmoil, Naira led Ethan through the remnants of her village, explaining the symbiotic relationship between the Aerolon and the glowing flora. As they walked, she caught him looking at her, a strange mixture of concern and something else in his eyes. It made her skin tingle, a sensation both unsettling and strangely comforting in the midst of the surrounding chaos. Ethan's touch, when he gently brushed a decaying leaf from her arm, sent a shiver down her spine. He was so different, his skin warm and rough compared to the smooth coolness of her own. Yet, there was a gentleness in his touch, a respect that surprised her. He saw her, not as an exotic alien, but as an equal, a fellow being suffering a devastating loss. Later, as they worked side by side in the makeshift lab aboard the evacuation platform, Naira noticed a small, faded photograph tucked into the corner of Ethan's datapad. It depicted a smiling woman with kind eyes, standing next to a young boy with a gap-toothed grin. Ethan caught her looking. "My parents," he said, his voice tinged with sadness. "They were lost when our colony on Kepler 186f was destroyed. A seismic event. 1 minute they were there, the next, he trailed off, his eyes clouding over." Naira reached out, her hand hovering over his. She hesitated, unsure if such a gesture would be appropriate. But the raw pain in his eyes mirrored her own, and she couldn't resist the urge to offer comfort. She gently placed her hand over his, the coolness of her skin a stark contrast to the warmth of his. For a moment, they simply held hands, a silent acknowledgement of their shared grief, a fragile bridge forming between two vastly different worlds. In that moment, Naira felt a flicker of hope, a spark of connection that transcended the fear and distrust that had been building between their peoples. Perhaps, together, they could find a way to save not only the light, but also each other. The sickly grey tendrils of the blight snaked across the vibrant blue of the jungle floor, its advance relentless. Panic gripped both the human settlements and the Aerolon villages as more and more floating islands began to crumble. Naira felt the weight of her people's fear like a physical burden. The Council of Wings, once respected for their wisdom and foresight, now faced accusations of inaction, of failing to protect the light. Ethan, oblivious to the whispers of doubt that followed him in the Aerolon camp, worked tirelessly in the makeshift lab. He analyzed samples of the infected flora, the faint glow of the dying plants reflecting in his troubled eyes. His initial findings, hinting at the link between the blight and human terraforming chemicals, had created a rift between him and Naira. She avoided his gaze, her shoulders stiff with distrust. He missed the warmth of her hand on his, the surprising coolness of her touch. He missed the way her golden eyes lit up when she explained the intricate workings of the Aerolon's bioengineered wings, the way her melodic voice resonated with the whispers of the jungle. He understood her anger, her pain. He felt responsible, not just as a scientist, but as a human. "We're close," he said, trying to bridge the distance between them. "I think I've isolated the protein responsible for the blight's rapid growth. If we can synthesize an antidote." Naira turned away, her silence a sharp rebuke. "Your people brought this upon us," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "How can I trust you, when your kind are responsible for the light's demise?" Ethan flinched. He reached out, then hesitated, his hand hovering in the air between them. The photograph of his parents, tucked into the corner of his datapad, seemed to mock him. He knew what it meant to lose everything, to watch your world crumble around you. He couldn't let that happen to Naira, to her people. "I know," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But I'm not them. I'm here to help. Please, let me help." Naira met his gaze, searching for sincerity in his eyes. She saw the grief he carried, the determination in his set jaw. She saw the genuine desire to make amends, to right the wrongs of his ancestors. A flicker of hope ignited within her. Perhaps he was different. He finally touched her hand, his fingers brushing against the smooth, cool skin. This time, she didn't flinch. A jolt, not of fear, but of something akin to warmth, coursed through her. His touch, so different from her own kind, felt right. A sudden tremor shook the platform, sending equipment clattering to the floor. The emergency lights flickered, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. A cry went up from outside, "The Great Willow! It's falling!" The Great Willow, the largest of the floating islands and the heart of the Airelon civilization, was succumbing to the blight. If it fell, it would take countless lives with it, and the resulting ecological imbalance could doom the entire planet. Naira's eyes widened in horror. She had to warn the council, to get them to evacuate. But the communication system was down, sabotaged by a faction of Airelon who believed human intervention was making the blight worse. She had to go herself, but the journey across the crumbling islands was treacherous, even for an experienced glider like her. "I have to go," she said, her voice strained. "I have to warn them." Ethan grabbed her arm. "It's too dangerous," he said, his voice urgent. Naira met his gaze, a new resolve hardening her features. She placed a small, bioluminescent seed in his hand. "This contains the genetic code of the Airelon wings," she said, her voice low. If I don't make it, you must find a way to integrate it with your technology. It's our only hope." Before Ethan could protest, she launched herself from the platform, her wings catching the wind, a flash of azure against the encroaching grey. He watched her go, his heart pounding in his chest, the small seed warm in his hand. He knew then that he couldn't go back to Earth, not while Naira, and the future of Ethel, hung in the balance. He was here to stay, to fight for the light, to fight for her. The seed pulsed faintly in Ethan's palm, a tiny beacon of hope amidst the encroaching despair. Naira's words echoed in his mind, "It's our only hope." He looked at the spreading grey blight, the skeletal remains of once vibrant flora, and felt a surge of protectiveness for the woman who had entrusted him with her people's future. He had to find a way to make it work, to integrate the Airelon bioengineering with human technology. Not just for Ethel, but for Naira. The thought of her risking her life to reach the council, her wings fragile against the decaying ecosystem, tightened his chest with a fear he hadn't felt since Kepler 186f. He poured all his energy, all his grief-fueled determination, into his research. The Airelon seed held the key, the genetic code for their bioengineered wings, their symbiotic link to the luminescent flora. He spliced it with a strain of terrestrial fungus, resistant to the blight's toxins, tweaking the genetic code, nurturing the fragile hybrid in a nutrient-rich solution. Days bled into nights, the rhythmic hum of the lab equipment a constant backdrop to his restless thoughts. He barely ate, barely slept, driven by the image of Naira's luminous golden eyes, the trust he saw in them despite the legacy of his people's actions. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, a tiny green sprout emerged, glowing faintly with the familiar blue luminescence. It was fragile, but strong, resistant to the blight's devastating touch. It was a start. He had to show Naira, to show the council. This could be the key to saving Ethel, to rebuilding the bridge between their two species. He activated the emergency comm system, his fingers trembling with anticipation and anxiety. After several tense minutes, a holographic image flickered to life. It was Naira, her face pale, a deep gash across her cheek, her wings dull and drooping. Relief flooded through him, so intense it almost brought him to his knees. She was alive. "Naira," he breathed, his voice rough with emotion. "I did it. I found a way. Look." He held up the glowing sprout, its tiny light a defiant spark in the darkness. Naira's eyes widened, a flicker of hope replacing the exhaustion in her gaze. but the hope was quickly overshadowed by fear. "It's too late," she whispered, her voice choked with despair. "The council, they've sealed themselves in the inner grove. They refuse any further contact with humans. They blame us for the blight. They blame me for trusting you." Ethan felt a pang of guilt, sharp and piercing. He knew his people's actions had caused this crisis, had eroded the trust between humans and Erelon. He looked at Naira's injured wing, the fading luminescence a mirror of her people's despair, and knew he couldn't give up. "Not now. I'll convince them," he said, his voice firm. "I'll show them what we can achieve together. Trust me." Naira's gaze held his. He saw a glimmer of her former spirit, the fire that had drawn him to her in the first place, rekindled by the fragile hope he offered. "How?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Meet me at the Great Willow," he said. "I have a plan." He ended the transmission and rushed to gather his equipment, his heart a chaotic mix of hope and fear. The Great Willow, though weakened by the blight, was still the symbolic heart of Erelon civilization. It was also the most vulnerable target, a tempting prize for the human factions who were growing increasingly restless, fearing the Erelon's advanced biotechnology might fall into the wrong hands. He had to get there first, had to show both sides that cooperation, not conflict, was the only way forward. He knew it was a gamble, possibly a fatal one. He could be captured, or worse, killed by either side. But he had to try. He had to prove to Naira, to himself, that he wasn't just another human exploiting Ethel's resources. He was here to protect it, to protect her. He adjusted the harness of his glider, his fingers brushing the small photograph of his parents. "I'm doing this for them too," he whispered, "for a future where we learn from the past, not repeat it." He launched himself into the twilight sky, the faint blue glow of his experimental flora illuminating his path, a fragile beacon of hope against the encroaching grey. The Great Willow was a skeletal giant, its massive branches reaching towards the sky like skeletal fingers, its luminescence dimmed, patches of sickly grey marring its once vibrant blue. Ethan landed his glider on a crumbling outcropping, the decay of the flora biting at his nostrils. He scanned the desolate landscape, fear gnawing at him. Where was Naira? A movement in the shadows caught his eye. Naira stepped into the fading light, her wings drooping, the gash on her cheek a stark red against her blue skin. She looked defeated, but in her golden eyes, Ethan saw a flicker of resolve. "The council, they won't listen," she said, her voice hollow. "They see you as a symbol of everything that's gone wrong." Ethan's heart sank. He had hoped the new flora, the proof of their potential synergy, would change their minds. He pulled out a small, pulsing vial containing the hybrid spores. "This could save them, Naira. Save all of us." Naira reached out, her fingers brushing his. The contact, brief as it was, sent a shiver down his spine. He felt the familiar warmth, but this time, there was a new element, a shared desperation, a plea for understanding. "They won't accept anything from a human," she whispered, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Especially not from me." Her gaze dropped, shame coloring her cheeks. Rumors of their growing bond had reached the council, fueling their distrust. A sudden roar ripped through the air. A human gunship, its markings identifying it as belonging to a rogue faction seeking to exploit Ethel's resources, swooped low, its weapons trained on the Great Willow. Ethan cursed under his breath. This was it, the moment of truth. He had to choose. He grabbed Naira's hand, the smooth, cool skin sending a familiar jolt through him. "Get to the communication array," he said, his voice urgent. "Broadcast the antidote's genetic code. Show them it works." Naira hesitated. The array was heavily guarded, her chances of reaching it slim. "But you?" "I'll distract them," he said, giving her hand a reassuring squeeze. He knew he might not survive the encounter. But he also knew he couldn't stand by while Ethel, while Naira, were destroyed. He gently pushed her towards the shadowed path leading to the communication center. "Go. I'll buy you some time." Naira watched as Ethan launched himself into the air, his glider a lone silhouette against the backdrop of the crumbling willow. Tears streamed down her face, blurring her vision. His courage, his willingness to sacrifice himself for her people, touched her in a way she couldn't comprehend. This was not the detached scientific curiosity she had initially perceived in him. This was something else entirely. Something deeper. Something she dared to name love. She wiped away her tears, a new determination hardening her features. She wouldn't let his sacrifice be in vain. She launched herself into the shadows, her heart pounding, her wings beating against the heavy air. She had to reach the array. She had to prove to her people, to herself, that Ethan was right, that humanity wasn't the enemy. The journey was treacherous, the decaying branches crumbling beneath her feet. She dodged patrols, her heart clenching with fear every time a shadow moved, every time a branch creaked. She finally reached the communication array, its control panel flickering erratically. Guards blocked her path, their faces grim. "By order of the Council, no transmissions are permitted," one of them said, his voice cold. Naira took a deep breath, summoning all her courage. "This transmission is vital to our survival," she said, her voice trembling but firm. She held out the data chip Ethan had given her, its surface glowing faintly with the hope of a new beginning. "It's the antidote. It's our only hope." The guards hesitated, suspicion warring with desperation in their eyes. Just then, a deafening explosion rocked the platform. Ethan's glider, engulfed in flames, plummeted towards the abyss. Naira gasped, her heart stopping in her chest. No. But even as grief tore through her, a spark of determination ignited within her. She wouldn't let him die for nothing. She thrust the data chip into the control panel, activating the emergency broadcast. The genetic code for the antidote, the testament to their combined efforts, streamed across the planet, reaching every human and Erelon settlement, a fragile whisper of hope amidst the chaos. The great willow groaned, its branches trembling, ready to collapse. And in that moment, as the world seemed to be falling apart, Naira felt Ethan's hand on hers, warm and reassuring. He had reached her just as the station began to fall. He wrapped her into his strong arms, and whispered in her ear, "I promise to protect you." The station broke down into the chasm, and they fell into the abyss. Ethan pulled Naira closer to him, shielding her with his body. His glider, though damaged, still had some power left. He managed to activate the emergency braking system, slowing their descent just moments before they crashed into the jungle floor. In the aftermath, the hybrid flora thrived, its vibrant blue glow slowly reclaiming the desolate gray. The floating island stabilized, their roots strengthened by the new, resilient flora. The great willow, though scarred, began to heal. Ethan and Naira stood hand in hand, watching the sunrise paint the revitalized jungle in hues of gold and azure. They had saved Ethel, but at a cost. The rogue human factions had been quelled, but the distrust between humans and Erelon remained, a deep chasm yet to be bridged. Their love, a beacon of hope amidst the wreckage, was met with suspicion and disapproval from both sides. "What now?" Naira asked, her voice laced with uncertainty. Ethan turned to her, his eyes reflecting the shimmering light of the new dawn. He gently cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs caressing her smooth, cool cheeks. "We rebuild," he said, his voice soft but firm. "Together." He leaned in, his lips brushing hers. The touch was tentative, gentle, a silent promise of a future where their love, a fragile seed planted in the ashes of destruction, might one day blossom into something beautiful and enduring. The future was uncertain, fraught with challenges, but in that moment, standing amidst the whispers of renewal, they knew they weren't alone. They had each other. And that, they realized, was enough. For now.